On this edition of Crime Chronicles, I come to you from Bucharest, or Bucharesti, the capital of Romania in the heart of Eastern Europe. We take a look at the December 1989 revolution, which was a culmination of the end of the Cold War and communism. We examine the execution of Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife Elena. Romania is known for a number of things, including its distinct food. Many Orthodox churches, after all, about 85 to 90% of Romanians are identified as Christian Orthodox. It's also remembered for being the fictional home in Transylvania, the northern part of the country, of Vlad the Impaler, who was the inspiration for the novel and movies to follow, Count Dracula. It's also remembered for a period in which many Romanians would just as soon forget but cannot. And that was the 50-year domination of this country by Soviet-style communism and its leader, Nicolae Ceausescu. There were many tyrants in 20th century Europe, the most infamous being Adolf Hitler of Germany, followed perhaps by Benito Mussolini of Italy, Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. Few Americans can name other dictators other than those three, and many Americans very foolishly and stupidly equate any politician they don't like with Adolf Hitler. And for that matter, they refer to anyone who disagrees with them on social media in the same terms. But there were other dictators in the 20th century that held reigns of terror over Europe, such as Enver Hoxha in Albania, Slobodan Milosevic in Yugoslavia or Serbia, and the man we're talking about now, Nicolae Ceausescu, here in Romania.
In many ways, Nicolae Ceausescu's upbringing and ascension to power was the prototypical communist success story. He was born in 1918 in the small village of Scarnicity, Romania, the third of 9 children of a poor peasant family. Wanting to escape his devoutly religious and abusive father, he left school at age 11 and went to Bucharest, Romania's capital city, to live with his sister. He became an apprentice shoemaker, working with a shoemaker who was an active member in the then illegal Communist Party. While there, Ceausescu got involved in Communist Party activities, becoming a member in early 1932. He was first arrested in 1933 at the age of 15 for street fighting during a strike, and again in 1934, first for collecting signatures on a petition protesting the trial of railway workers, and twice more for other similar activities. Like much of Europe during the pre-World War II 1930s, Romania was falling under the control of fascist dictators, who were the arch enemies of the type of communism to which Ceausescu was devoted. In 1936, he was labeled a dangerous communist agitator and distributor of communist and anti-fascist propaganda materials. He was sentenced to prison and released after serving 3 years. World War II officially began in Europe on September 1, 1939, and lasted until April 1945. Nicolae Ceausescu spent most of World War II in prison, along with many other communists. During his imprisonment, he befriended another communist comrade, George Georgiadei, the eventual president of Romania and Ceausescu's predecessor. Romania was allied with Nazi Germany during most of World War II, and Adolf Hitler and other European fascists despised communism. Hitler coveted Romania not only for the sake of his own evil vanity, but for the country's petroleum. Romania was and still is one of Europe's most oil-rich countries.
The Soviet Union, dominated by Russia, came to power in Eastern Europe at the end of World War II, when the Allied powers split up Europe into Western and Eastern blocs. Western Europe, comprised of France, West Germany, and a few other countries, being capitalist democracies. Eastern Europe being part of what was called the Warsaw Pact, a forced alliance between Eastern European countries and the Soviet Union. Romania fell under the Eastern Bloc of the Warsaw Pact, and communism really came to power in the late 1940s here.
In the summer of 1944, as World War II wound to a close, it became increasingly clear that Hitler's Nazi regime was losing to the Allied powers, led by the United States, Great Britain, and Romania's closest Allied neighbor, the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin's Russia, a country long hated by the Romanian people. Seeing their alliance with Germany as a liability and that their future lay in a line with the hated Russia and the Soviet Union, Romania, led by King Michael, who had deposed the country's fascist prime minister, switched sides, just as they had done in World War I. When the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain emerged victorious after World War II, and the Soviet Union having thousands of its troops in Romanian territory, the three victorious Allied powers, especially the United States and the Soviet Union, carved out spheres of influence in Europe, with most of Western Europe falling under the influence of the United States and Western democracy, and most of Eastern Europe, including Romania, falling under the domination of the Communist Soviet Union. As Great Britain's Winston Churchill proclaimed in a 1946 speech in Missouri, an iron curtain had fallen over Europe, split between Western democracy and capitalism, and communism dominating Romania and the rest of Eastern Europe, shutting it off from the rest of the world. It is said that behind every good man is a good woman, but it might also be said that behind every evil man there is an equally evil woman. In 1939, just before the outbreak of World War II, Nicolae Ceausescu met Elena Petrescu, whom he married in 1946 and who would play a significant role in his political life, serving unofficially as his right hand and serving officially as deputy prime minister. Without question, she was the second most powerful person in Romania during her husband's reign. Although Nicolae Ceausescu was an evil man and had many faults, marital infidelity was not one of them. Once he met Elena, who was as devoted to communist ideals as Nicolae and was his partner in all things good and bad, he never looked at another woman. But in years to come, Elena, a crude, crass, profane, abusive, demanding woman, would become as hated as Nicolae himself. Elena Ceausescu was an extremely vain person. Being self-conscious of her large nose, she forbade anyone from photographing her in profile. Although she was never attractive nor elegant, she spent profligately on clothes, purses, home decorations, and anything she desired. Although she possessed little formal education, she was awarded doctoral degrees in chemistry and served as co-author on many academic publications. Although in truth she knew little about chemistry and contributed practically nothing, actual university researchers doing all the work and assigning her as co- or lead author. Elena was awarded over a dozen honorary doctorates and accolades from universities around the world, all in deference to her husband's political influence. By 1947, with the war having been over for 2 years and with Romania under the control of Soviet-style communism, and with his former prison inmate Georgiu Dej in power, Nicolae Ceausescu was elected a member of a great national assembly, the Romanian legislature. Over the next 2 decades, Nicolae Ceausescu, with Elena walking in step beside him, climbed the political ladder and occupied several positions in the Romanian government, many of which his only qualification being his alliance with the president and other Communist Party bosses. Despite having never served in the military, he was appointed lieutenant general in the army and eventually deputy minister of defense. Despite never having worked on a farm or in agriculture, he headed the Ministry of Agriculture. He was also appointed to the Romanian Politburo, a collection of party bosses who held most of the power in Romania. When President Georgiu Dej died in March 1965, Ceausescu was not the obvious successor, despite his closeness to the longtime leader. But widespread infighting by older and more connected officials led the Politburo to choose Ceausescu as a compromise candidate. Ceausescu came to power in 1965. He would stay in power for the remaining 24 years of his life.
Although Ceausescu is remembered very unfavorably today, during his reign in the late 1960s throughout the 1970s, into the 1980s, he was admired by many Western government officials, including U.S. presidents. The reason, although Romania was in the Soviet Union's bloc or orbit of control, Ceausescu has distanced himself or distanced Romania from the Soviet Union in several ways and stood up to them.
In the United States, we are accustomed to the notion that a president and many governors and mayors should not be allowed to remain in office beyond a certain length of time. George Washington established the precedent of limiting presidents to 2 terms, something which formally came into effect in the 1940s, shortly after the death of President Franklin Roosevelt, the only president to serve more than 2 terms. In the United States and modern democracies, assassination or forced removal are not acceptable means of changing government. If we do not like someone, we vote them out. We do not kill them, exile them, or throw them in jail. But throughout most of human history, this has not been the case. Most governments from the ancient world to today have been headed by monarchs and dictators who only relinquished power when they died, were murdered, or were forced out, and often were succeeded by another dictator, be it a political ally or a relative.
In the United States, we do not accept assassination of leaders as a suitable way of changing governments. But what does one do with someone who will simply not vacate? In terms of human history, democracies in which government leaders leave voluntarily are the exception rather than the rule. Throughout most of human history, most people who have been in charge of government, particularly dictators, have to be forced out, sometimes killed. And that's what happened in 1989 here in Romania. The execution of the Ceausescus in 1989 might qualify as an example of what one person has called tyrannicide, the murder of a tyrant. How does one dispose of a corrupt, evil, murderous leader who simply will not vacate office? In the minds of many people, the only way is the way that was met by the Ceausescus.
Assassination is viewed as undemocratic, which is the main reason American presidents were not offered full-time protection for the first 125 years of the nation's existence. How does a country dispose of a tyrant? The answer is tyrannicide, the killing of a tyrant or a dictator. This is the fate that Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu would suffer in 1989, but not before they would plunge their nation to economic ruin and impose a reign of terror that could not even be imagined by George Orwell in his dystopian novel 1984, where the state harshly controls and monitors every citizen's actions and thoughts. Initially, Ceausescu was popular in Romania, Western Europe, Canada, and even in the United States. Although the United States opposed anything related to communism, they believe, wrongly it turned out, that Ceausescu was a good, benign, reform-minded communist, and they especially praised his distancing Romania from the domination of the Soviet Union to a much greater degree than other European countries in the Soviet sphere of influence, like East Germany and Bulgaria. In the 1960s, Ceausescu eased press censorship and ended Romania's active participation in the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance comprised of the Soviet Union and Eastern European countries under its control.
In 1968, an event known as the Prague Spring, so named after the capital of Czechoslovakia, took place, in which Czechoslovakians, under the leadership of Alexander Dubček, rebelled against Soviet authority and Soviet rule. The Soviet Union ordered an invasion of Czechoslovakia and ordered most of its Eastern European allies to participate in that invasion. But Ceausescu said no. He stood up to the Soviet Union at great risk, and this made him a hero in the allies of Western powers.
When the Soviet Union and other Warsaw Pact countries invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968 to brutally suppress an uprising there, Ceausescu won praise in Romania and the world over by not only refusing to participate, but for openly condemning the Soviet Union in an August 21st speech. He even traveled to the Czechoslovakian capital of Prague a week before the invasion to offer his support to the country's leader, Alexander Dubček.
Because of his willingness to stand up to the Soviet Union, Nicolae Ceausescu became a hero not only in the eyes of his own people, but in the eyes of Western governments. In 1969, President Richard Nixon became the first U.S. president to visit the new Romanian Republic, and Nicolae Ceausescu became the first Romanian president to visit the White House. Nicolae Ceausescu was praised by Western leaders. In his 1969 visit to Washington, D.C., Ceausescu stood on the balcony of the White House, where Richard Nixon called him a great man, a great leader for standing up to the Soviet Union. In the early 1970s, Romania secured a business deal with Great Britain. Ceausescu insisted that for the deal to go forward, he be royally greeted, literally, and that he be able to ride on a motorcade throughout London with Queen Elizabeth. In the late 1970s, President Jimmy Carter, probably the most naive and trusting president we've ever had, called Ceausescu a great leader and a great man of a great country.
Ceausescu's outreach and visits to other countries were not only an attempt to improve Romania's standing on the world stage. Always self-conscious about his peasant background and lack of formal education, plus a speech impediment that his minions sought to disguise, and at which Romanians silently laughed, both he and his wife Elena relished hobnobbing with American presidents and European royalty as equals. During the first 5 years of Ceausescu's reign, conditions in Romania improved. Standards of living rose and access to education increased. Although Ceausescu was disliked by his giant neighbor to the east, the Soviet Union, he was respected in some Western countries, as well as countries in the Middle East like Egypt and in Asian countries like China and North Korea. But Ceausescu was a communist idealist at heart and was determined to remake Romania into a Marxist-Leninist utopia with no dependence on outside aid or influence, no matter what price he had to exact from his citizens. When agricultural and industrial production fell off in the mid-1960s because of a labor shortage, he banned abortion and birth control with the idea of forcing families to have more children. This edict took effect in 1966, and the result was the birth of hundreds of thousands of unwanted children, especially children with physical or mental infirmities. After Ceausescu's downfall in 1989, the outside world discovered the horrors of Romania's orphanages. Thousands of children lived under hard conditions, far beyond the scope ever dreamed of in the mind of English novelist Charles Dickens in books like Oliver Twist. How did Ceausescu stay in power? In addition to currying favor with the military, Ceausescu, his wife, and closest supporters concentrated on building a personality cult. Although he was neither a gifted public speaker or a handsome man, he focused on making himself and Elena come across as the father and mother that saved the nation and instilled a sense of national pride and stood up to some of Romania's stronger and more powerful neighbors, namely Hungary, Germany, Turkey, and Russia, that had exploited Romania and its three principal regions, Wallachia, Transylvania, and Moldavia, for centuries.
Well, I'm standing now in a small park in the old city of Bucharest, and one question comes to mind, is that what was life really like under communism in Eastern Europe? Now, most Americans, particularly in my generation, were taught to believe that everything about communism was bad, but a more slightly nuanced view emerges when one talks to people who lived under communism, particularly the older generation in countries like Romania, East Germany, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia. The answer is something like this. There are a few rules that one would have to obey in order to survive and be content under communism. Now, one was that there was pretty much zero unemployment under communism. Everyone had a job. Now, the problem there is that one could not advance beyond that position. You had to be content with the job you had unless you were a prominent member of the Communist Party. Another thing to keep in mind is that one had a job, one also had a place to live. Homelessness was pretty much extinct or did not exist under communism. So if a person was content with the job they had, with the place they had to live, and with meager but perhaps minimal access to food, then one could survive. The other rule was you could dare not complain. Anyone who breathed a word of discontent against the communist government might suffer severe recriminations. If one could live with that set of rules, you might be content. And in fact, some of the older people here in former communist Eastern Europe long for the days of communism because at least their life had some sort of order. But Ceausescu's most potent weapon was the Securitate, the Romanian secret police. While some Romanians were indeed imprisoned, tortured, or killed by the Securitate, it was the mere fear and suspicion and paranoia generated by the Securitate that was its greatest weapon. As you might be able to see behind me, there's a Thai restaurant. Now, what the patrons of this restaurant no doubt do not know was this was a place, with a basement more specifically, where Nicolae Ceausescu's secret police would torture arrestees and suspects and those who opposed his regime. Nicolae Ceausescu's reign of terror over Romania was so complete, and the power of its secret service so great, or secret security, or secret police, I should say, was so great that Romanians could not trust each other, even their own family members. Secret police would either bribe or intimidate people into ratting out their loved ones, employees, friends, neighbors. Romanians never knew who the spy among them might be. It might even be a spouse. Children informed on parents. Any sentiment that was deemed as rebellious or in opposition to the Ceausescu government would lead to the secret arrest and imprisonment, torture, and sometimes even death of that person. A few days ago, I took a tour of what's called Life Under Communism in Romania. And the tour guide told me the following story to demonstrate how complete the control of the secret police was over the Romanian population. After Ceausescu's fall in 1989, the archives of the secret police were open to the public. Now, many people did not care to know who informed on them. It might, to say the least, tear apart a relationship they did not know had been damaged. But some people did go to the trouble to look at the files secret police had on them or on a loved one or a friend. In one case, a man went through the files to see what the secret police had on him. It even got so detailed as to they documented a case in which he went to a grocery store and what he purchased in the grocery store, and he thought there was no way anyone could have known about that insignificant event in his life. But such was the control of the secret police, and such was the terror that was instilled in the Romanian population, and the legacy of that terror is still with them today in many respects.
For centuries, Romanians have been a devoutly religious people, with most of its citizens belonging to the Romanian Orthodox Church. The Orthodox Church has long been a potent force in Romania, and the Ceausescu government, adhering to the official communist doctrine of atheism, while not outlawing the practice of Christianity in the country, made every effort to turn the hearts and minds of the people away from any institution and any sense of individuality, and toward the government. A seminal event came in 1971 when Ceausescu visited the communist states of North Korea, China, and Vietnam. He was especially impressed with the personality cult that had arisen around Chinese leader Mao Zedong and North Korean President Kim Il-sung. Ceausescu returned to Romania determined to build the same type of cult around himself and his wife Elena. By the mid-1980s, Romania was in considerable debt to other countries, and Ceausescu, determined to make Romania the perfect socialist state that depended on no one, was determined to pay it back. The national debt was repaid, but Romanians paid the cost, already subsisting on whatever meager rations the government allowed, as no one was allowed to own private property or to rise any further than they already were in terms of career. Romania was plunged into poverty. Black markets flourished, with very few Romanians, usually party bosses, only entitled to anything but the barest essentials. Isolated rebellions broke out around the country. In 1987, in the city of Brasov in Romania's Transylvania region, thousands of workers went on strike and staged protests in response to the government's draconian rationing policies. The Ceausescu government and the Securitate responded with brute force. The city of Brasov was under siege. Hundreds were arrested, imprisoned, and tortured, and the rebellion was suppressed. Life under Ceausescu's communist government simply went from bad to worse. The Securitate was in full force, brutally suppressing any hint of dissent throughout the country. As Romanians were suffering, Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu were living like royalty, completely oblivious to their fellow citizens' suffering. Their residences were palatial. Whenever they visited another country, Elena went on shopping sprees at the finest department stores in cities like New York, London, and Paris. Not only were their spending habits the object of gossip, so was their theft. The Ceausescus stole from whoever hosted them. The most glaring symbol of Ceausescu's megalomania still sits in the center of Bucharest. In 1984, one of Bucharest's most storied neighborhoods, Uranus Hill, was razed to make room for the Palace of the Parliament, a grand testament to one dictator's ego. The palace, which has never been finished, is second only to the American Pentagon in space, the second largest building in the world. It still stands as a monument to the failure of a nation controlled completely by the state and one man's megalomania.
What precipitated the downfall of Nicolae Ceausescu? It happened like this. In 1989, the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union was crumbling. Economic conditions, the realization that life was better in the West, were slowly making conditions for tyrannical Soviet-style communist governments in Eastern Europe impossible to sustain. But Nicolae Ceausescu was blind to what was going on throughout the rest of the world.
By 1989, the seeds of revolution were being planted, not just by Romanians, but throughout Eastern Europe. Soviet-style communism was failing. The Soviet Union, which had invaded Afghanistan at the beginning of the decade, was withdrawing. Economies in the Soviet bloc countries of Eastern Europe, that being East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Bulgaria, were failing. Formerly independent countries that had been forcibly annexed by the Soviet Union, including Ukraine, Georgia, and the Baltic states, were demanding an end to domination under their despised Russian masters. In 1987, President Ronald Reagan stood in West Berlin and declared that all the world could see in communism was failure. And in typical Reaganite dramatic fashion, he implored the new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, to tear down this wall, referring to the Berlin Wall. In the fall of 1989, The Berlin Wall, which had divided East and West Berlin for decades, was indeed torn down. It signaled the end of Russian domination of Eastern Europe, and one by one, communist regimes and the Soviet Union itself peacefully dissolved and gave way to democracy.
By the fall of 1989, Soviet-style communism in Eastern Europe was on its way out. The Berlin Wall, which separated East from West Berlin in East Germany, had fallen. Other communist governments had followed suit. But Ceausescu and his wife Elena were so out of touch, they had no realization that their empire, their government, their fall might be next.
But Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu, now in their 70s, were completely oblivious. They were out of touch and still believed that promising higher salaries and more food rationing, coupled with the Securitate cracking down on any dissenters, would solve everything. They did not know their days might be numbered. A spark was needed to overthrow the Ceausescus, and that spark came in western Romania, in a city called Timișoara.
The spark that triggered Ceausescu's downfall in the fall of 1989 actually occurred in the western part of Romania. A Hungarian priest said to his flock on one occasion that this will be my last time addressing you because I'm about to go to jail, about to be arrested by Nicolae Ceausescu's secret police. And he was right. And that was when the revolt started in the western part of Romania. Ceausescu and his wife Elena ordered their troops to broke no quarter with protesters, and the results were deadly.
Demonstrations in the city of Timișoara were triggered by the government-sponsored attempt to evict Laszlo Tokis, an ethnic Hungarian pastor accused by the government of inciting ethnic hatred. Members of his ethnic Hungarian congregation surrounded his apartment in a show of support. Romanian students joined the demonstration along with their ethnic Hungarian counterparts, which soon lost nearly all connection to its initial cause and became a more general anti-government demonstration. Regular military forces, police, and the Securitate fired on the demonstrators on 17 December 1989, killing and injuring men, women, and children, but the extent of the carnage may have been exaggerated by anti-government sources. In a further indication of his blindness to the conditions in Romania, Ceausescu left the country on 18 December 1989 for a visit to Iran, leaving the duty of crushing the Timișoara revolt to his subordinates and his wife Elena. Upon his return to Romania on December 20th, the situation became even more tense, and he gave a televised speech from the TV studio inside the Central Committee building in Bucharest, in which he spoke about the events at Timișoara as an interference of foreign forces in Romania's internal affairs and an external aggression on Romania's sovereignty. Romanians who received little to no information of the events in Timișoara from their own media learned about the revolt from anti-communist radio stations that broadcast news in the Eastern Bloc throughout the Cold War, such as Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, and by word of mouth.
Having heard of the revolt in Western Romania, Ceausescu decided to do what he always did best, call a rally and make a speech. And that's what he did. On December 21st, 1989, the area, which you'll see in another shot here, was filled with approximately 100,000 attendees at Ceausescu's speech. It turned out to be his last.
On December 21st, 1989, Ceausescu staged a mass meeting in Bucharest. Official media presented it as a spontaneous movement of support for Ceausescu, something he had done before, with Ceausescu standing atop party headquarters and the front lines filled with his minions clapping and cheering in unison and holding signs of his wife and himself. But this time would be different, and no one was more surprised at the outcome than the Ceausescus.
This is the balcony from which Nicolae Ceausescu made his final speech on December 21st, 1989. On December 21st, 1989, Nicolae Ceausescu, accompanied by his wife Elena, took the stage, if you will, at this balcony right here behind me. And the front row, first several rows of people, were lined with Ceausescu supporters who did as they usually did, clapped in unison, cheered everything he said, held Ceausescu banners, and Ceausescu, trying to appease, or so he thought, the angry sentiments of the Romanian people, promised to increase wages and offer some other benefits, which in the past he thought had been used to pacify his population.
The mass meeting of 21 December, held in what is now Revolution Square, began like many of Ceausescu's speeches over the years. He spoke of the achievements of the socialist revolution and Romania's multilateral developed socialist society. Harking to the dark days of World War II and Adolf Hitler, he blamed the Timisoara riots on fascist agitators who want to destroy socialism.
There are many YouTube videos of Ceausescu's last speech on December 21st, 1989, from the balcony behind me. And what one notices is that the speech starts off okay, but then something happens that distracts Ceausescu and leads to a shocked expression on his face. It was either a gunshot or a hand grenade or some sort of distraction in the crowd that made Ceausescu realize that along with the cheering as well as the cheering, he had lost control of his audience.
Nicolae Ceausescu had misjudged the crowd's mood. Some conspiracy theorists have alleged that Ceausescu's underlings anticipated such a reaction and set him up to fail. Roughly 8 minutes into his speech, several people began jeering and booing, and others began chanting Timisoara. He tried to silence them by raising his right hand and calling for the crowd's attention before order was temporarily restored, then proceeded to announce social benefit reforms that included raising the national minimum wage by January 1st. Images of Ceausescu's facial expression as the crowd began to boo and heckle him were among the most widely broadcast of the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. The look on his face said it all. The dictatorship of Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu was coming to an end. Hearing that protesters were entering the building and having lost control of the crowd, the Ceausescus took cover inside the building that housed the Central Committee of the Romanian Communist Party. The rest of the day saw an open revolt in Bucharest population, which had assembled in University Square, now called Revolution Square, and confronted the police and army at barricades. The rioters, however, were no match for the military apparatus concentrated in Bucharest, which cleared the streets by midnight and arrested hundreds of people in the process. But this suppression would only be temporary. This time, the Romanian people were determined to rid themselves of the tyrant Ceausescu.
The jeers and the signs of protest at Ceausescu's last speech became so overwhelming that he began to believe the unthinkable, that his life was in danger and so was his rule. So, as protesters were entering the palace behind me, Ceausescu and his wife Elena, accompanied by 2 or 3 others, escaped via helicopter right here.
By the morning of December 22nd, the rebellion had spread to all major cities across the country. The suspicious death of Vasile Milea, Ceausescu's defense secretary, later confirmed as an accidental suicide, was announced by the media. Believing that Milea had been murdered, rank-and-file soldiers switched sides to the revolution almost en masse. They were ordered to crack down on protesters, but refused, joining with the protesters instead. The commanders wrote off Ceausescu as a lost cause and made no effort to keep their men loyal to the government. Ceausescu made a last desperate attempt to address the crowd gathered in front of the Central Committee building, but before he could even speak, the people in the square began throwing stones and other projectiles at him, forcing him to take refuge in the building once more. He, Elena, and 4 others managed to get to the roof and escape by helicopter, only seconds ahead of a group of demonstrators who had followed them there. The helicopter was so overloaded that it could barely fly, but the Ceausescus escaped Bucharest. But the bloodshed was not over. Determined to hang on to power and egged on by their leader, who was pretending to side with the protesters, the Securitate declared war on its own people. Securitate snipers killed Romanians in the streets of Bucharest and engaged in open battles with protesters and the army in other Romanian cities. Initial reports were that 64,000 people had been killed or wounded by the Securitate, but that figure was highly exaggerated. After Ceausescu's death, hospitals around the country reported a death toll of fewer than 1,000, and probably much lower than that. The Securitate eventually either surrendered or simply went into hiding.
The Ceausescus are, to say the least, taken aback at this turn of events. As they leave Bucharest on this helicopter, the pilot of the helicopter receives word of what's going on, and everyone except the Ceausescus realizes that their reign is coming to an end. So the pilot says falsely that there are the mechanical issues of some sort, that he has to drop the Ceausescus off pretty much in the middle of nowhere, and that's what happens. So the Ceausescus find their way to a nearby military base, thinking for sure that the military will protect them, and that turned out to not be the case.
So what were the Ceausescus doing during all of this carnage? They had fled the capital and flew by helicopter to Ceausescu's Snagov residence, from which they fled again, this time to Targovisti. They abandoned the helicopter near Targovisti, having been ordered to land by the army, which by that time had restricted flying in Romania's airspace. The Ceausescus were held by the police and eventually handed over to the army.
Once they were taken into custody by their own military, the Ceausescus were about to experience karma, if you will, a taste of their own type of justice. A hastily arranged military trial was held on December 25th, Christmas Day, which lasted the entirety of 1 hour. The Ceausescus were allowed about 10 minutes to consult with an attorney, but their guilt and the sentence was predetermined before the trial even started. They were found guilty after the 1 hour trial, taken out, and a few minutes later, shot to death.
On Christmas Day, December 25th, 1989, the Ceausescus were tried before a court convened in a small room on orders of the National Salvation Front, Romania's provisional government. They faced charges including illegal gathering of wealth and genocide. Ceausescu repeatedly denied the court's authority to try him and asserted he was still legally the president of Romania. Throughout the trial, they were defiant and still in denial that their rule and their lives were coming to an end. At the end of the trial, the Ceausescus were found guilty and sentenced to death. The trial lasted less than 1 hour.
Romanian soldiers who had turned on the Ceausescus gleefully tied the hands of Nicolae and Elena, and their anxiousness to take part in the assassination was so pronounced that there were too many volunteers to participate, and before TV cameras could start filming the execution, the shooting had already started. The last few seconds of the execution can be seen on YouTube.
A soldier standing guard in the proceedings was ordered to take the Ceausescus outside one by one and shoot them. But once they realized their fate, the Ceausescus demanded to die together. The soldiers agreed to this and began to tie their hands behind their backs, which the Ceausescus protested, with Elena, true to her nature, cursing the soldiers, calling them sons of dogs. The trial was captured on film and later broadcast to the world and is still available on YouTube. Most likely, the Ceausescus did not know that some of their former party loyalists were engineering the trial and quick verdict, fearing that a prolonged trial would allow them to spill the beans on their misdeeds as well. Soldiers were eager to execute the couple. Captain Ian Oboru led the execution squad, joined by 7 other non-commissioned officers who were recruited from about 20 volunteers. Before his sentence was carried out, Nicolae Ceausescu sang the Internationale while being led towards the wall. The firing squad began shooting as soon as the two were in their positions up against the wall. So eager to fire, they did not wait for the cameras to begin filming. Later that day, the execution was shown on Romanian television. The hasty show trial and the images of the dead Ceausescus were videotaped, and the footage released to the world 2 days after the execution. The way the trial was conducted has been criticized, with President George H.W. Bush expressing concern as well, while also not exactly heartbroken over the downfall of Eastern Europe's last communist dictator. But Ion Iliescu, Romania's provisional president, said that the trial was quite shameful but necessary in order to end the state of near anarchy that had gripped the country in the 3 days since the Ceausescus fled Bucharest. Similarly, Victor Stanisculescu, who had been defense minister before going over to the revolution, said that the alternative would have been seeing the Ceausescus lynched on the streets of Bucharest.
The execution of Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu was the last use of capital punishment in Romania. As soon as there was a change in government, one of the first actions of that government was to abolish the death penalty. Standing where I am right now and doing what I'm doing, taking video of government buildings in Bucharest would have been unthinkable during the reign of Nicolae Ceausescu. Even walking onto this space would have caught the attention of the police here. And by now, I would have been thrown in jail in very uncomfortable positions. But things have changed since the downfall of Ceausescu.
On July 21, 2010, forensic scientists exhumed the bodies to perform DNA tests to prove conclusively that they were indeed the remains of the Ceausescus. The body believed to be Elena's had decayed too much to allow for a positive ID, but Nicolae was easily identifiable, wearing the bullet-riddled black winter coat he had been wearing during the execution. DNA tests were able to conclusively prove his identity.
What you see behind me is a monument to the victims of the Christmas Revolution of 1989. Local Bucharestis refer to this sometimes as the potato on a stick monument or the olive martini monument. Nevertheless, it is a monument to the Christmas Revolution. Since this is a podcast about crime and criminal justice, one might ask, well, what does the fall of an Eastern European dictator have to do with crime and criminal justice? The answer is this. I had this conversation yesterday with a person who is much more well-versed in this area than I am. And the question I asked of him was, how does one secure that kind of power in a country? His answer was something like this. First, one controls freedom of speech and one punishes freedom of speech. And one does that by controlling the news media. Second, one enforces that lack of freedom of speech by controlling the criminal justice system, controlling police forces, controlling prosecutors, controlling judges, and controlling the entire judiciary. That is how one attains power to the level of a person like Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania.
A side note about the monstrosity still known as the Palace of the Parliament. Nicolae Ceausescu had visions of standing atop the palace, addressing throngs of his subjects standing beneath him. That dream never came true. In fact, the first person to stand atop the palace and address the Romanian people was not Nicolae Ceausescu, but Michael Jackson, who wrongly referred to Bucharest as Budapest, the capital of Hungary. The execution of Nicolae Ceausescu marked the end of communist and Russian domination over much of Eastern Europe. It ushered in a new set of challenges, but whereas Romania and other Eastern European countries were formerly closed off to the world, they are thriving both economically and politically, to varying degrees for sure, but to a much greater degree than had been the case throughout the second half of the 20th century. Plus, with the death of the Ceausescus, the Cold War, which had pitted Western democracies against communism, had come to an end, with democracy victorious, and the new set of challenges presented, including the ascendancy of the terrorist group Al-Qaeda and the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq.
That about wraps up this case, the execution of Nicolae Ceausescu. So, one other thing that Romanians are noted for is great beer, which I'm enjoying right now. So here's to the people of Romania, the death of a tyrant, and cheers, or as they say in Romania, noroc. Well, I hope you enjoyed this edition of Crime Chronicles. As we delve into the darker side of human nature, we invite you to join us on our journey by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Your support helps make possible our inquiry into the sometimes unsettling but always fascinating phenomenon known as crime and justice. So hit that like and subscribe button right now and don't miss future episodes. Till then, Mark Jones, hoping you will join our Crime Chronicles community. And thanks for tuning in.